In the 2015 Hollywood Reporter's Directors Roundtable, Quentin Tarantino confirmed the rumors that he wants to stop directing after his 10th feature-length film, a sentiment that garnered and still garners a lot of conversation on the idea of filmographies. It is reassuring, especially from a cinephile perspective, to hear an artist so aware of their own work and the overall impact of the intertextuality between their works. I don't know how I fully feel about Tarantino's somewhat arbitrary self-imposition. I mean, just look at Scorsese, who made The Wolf of Wall Street, Irishman, and Killers of the Flower Moon all in his 70s, or even Kurosawa, who was going blind during the production of and released Ran at the age of 75. But at the same time, for every Kurosawa we have a Francis Ford Coppola, no shade intended. So I definitely do understand where Tarantino is coming from, especially when you're a name as big as Tarantino or Nolan or Anderson. Audiences come in with expectations built around your previous work. And I don't know about you guys, but when I think about 21st century auteurs who have near flawless filmographies, with each entry adding something completely unique, one of the first names to come to my mind, and probably my favorite as of right now, is Denis Villeneuve, the subject of my first filmography dive. At first, I wanted to just create a simple ranked video, but I think there's a lot more to learn and analyze with Denis' filmography by going chronologically, and eventually at the end I will give you my overall ranking of his work, so let's get right into it. In contrast to a lot of the other big-name filmmakers out there, Denis had a much more interesting start to his career. He was clearly always talented, but he didn't necessarily come out hitting big with a jaw-dropping directorial debut that put him in the forefront and propelled him from there on. His first two feature-length efforts as a director, August 32nd on Earth and Maelstrom, are Canadian productions, primarily in French, highly minimalistic, and in every sense of the word, are indie productions. And while both of these films definitely have their merits, I wouldn't go much further than simply calling them interesting looks at a future master's early career. Denis has always had a clear talent for visual storytelling, which I think comes across best in both of these pictures. They both have beautiful cinematography that often enhances the somewhat lacking plots. August 32nd on Earth follows a woman who asks her best friend to impregnate her following a life-threatening accident. It is a slow film that, ironically, while starting with a car crash, takes a while to truly get going. I never felt fully devoted to either of these characters, and some of their decision making is a bit infuriating. However, once the film does get going and we enter the deserts of Utah and the rising action, I do think a lot of Denis' future mastery is on display. The imagery is beautiful. For the first time in the film, it feels like there are genuine consequences to these characters' actions, and thankfully the picture leans a lot more into the philosophy of the situation presented. I am not the biggest fan of the ending, but for a directorial future, this is a respectable effort. A lot of the issues I have with August 32nd, I also have with Maelstrom. This time, Denis tackles a similarly dramatic situation as we follow a woman who questions her life and her purpose following an abortion. Truthfully, Maelstrom goes to much more interesting places than August 32nd did. It tackles substance abuse, what it means to truly love a person, and once again the consequences of one's choices. Simultaneously though, it just takes so long to get where it needs to go. There is a lack of urgency throughout the film, and the plot can feel a bit muddled, often going through the motions. In essence, there are two halves of this film, which are admittedly nicely connected on a plot level. Bibane's response to her abortion, which is substance abuse and living quite aimlessly, which leads to her accidentally killing a man while inebriated. The rest of the film from there on tackles the aftermath of this clearly heavy topic, and where the film goes from here, I say, is the best storytelling and filmmaking of Villeneuve's early career. My main complaint with Maelstrom is that the filmmaking feels aimless in the middle, and it was hard for me to get invested for the first half of the film. While this may be intentional given the state of our main character following her abortion, it just didn't work for me. But once this movie does get going, it is quite good. Ratings wise, I'd give August 32nd a 5 out of 10 and Maelstrom a 6 out of 10. What I find the most interesting about Denis' career from here on is that he takes a near decade-long break. His directorial and sophomore efforts didn't hit immediately and spiral him into superstardom, but that didn't stop him nonetheless. There isn't much public information about what he did during this period, but what we do know is that he came back in 2009 with what can be seen as his revamped directorial debut, and this time around, similar to the Nolans, Tarantinos, and Andersons of the world, he hasn't quite slowed down ever since. In fact, as you will notice notice, the scale and ambition of his films just gets bigger and bigger with each film that he makes. 2009's Polytechnique is easily the hardest film for me to talk about in this video. This is the one movie that I didn't revisit for this video because, well, it's about a school shooting, in particular the 1989 Montreal Massacre. It's one of those that you watch once, appreciate what it's doing, allow for it to sink in, and really dissect what I think about a situation like this, and just, don't watch again. For what it is, Polytechnique shows true mastery of the craft involved in filmmaking. Polytechnique tackles both the tragedy of school shootings, the loss of young life associated with such an event, and the dangers of misogyny. All topics that, if not handled meticulously, can go downhill quite fast. But Denis takes a unique approach to this style of filmmaking, and it works for me. It is a thought-provoking work that broadened my horizons, introducing me to an event that I wasn't aware of prior to watching Polytechnique. I fully understand where a lot of the critiques of this movie can come from, who exactly is being honored by recreating such an event. There are definitely people out there that can easily misinterpret Denis' intentions, but for me, having first watched this movie at a relatively young age, it emotionally landed and had an impact on the way I think, which is, in my opinion, the best thing a movie can do. Just gotta hope that it lands right. The cinematography, while not my favorite thing, does serve its purpose quite well. All the performances are good and the camera work is highly impactful. While I do find it hard to rate a film like this objectively, I would give it somewhere between a 7 and a 8. I watched Incendies for the first time for this video, so all of these thoughts are fresh, and while this is very contradictory, both take what I say with a grain of salt and simultaneously appreciate the impact this movie had on a first viewing. Because I think Incendies is one of the greatest films I have ever seen, and if not that, easily one of the most impactful pieces of cinema that I have ever experienced. And no, this is not the last time I will say that in this video, but the fact that Denis created this masterpiece so early in his career caught me off guard. I had saved this as my last viewing because my expectations for Incendies weren't as high as they should have been. I will not be avoiding spoilers, so I'll just go ahead and say please watch this movie if you haven't, and that I give it full marks. On a narrative level, this film unfolds so masterfully. Every bit and piece that is sprinkled throughout this movie comes together for one of the outright best but most harrowing reveals ever put on the silver screen. The time jumping at first can feel a bit jarring and hard to keep up with, but once you're adjusted and fully know the two worlds you're being transported back and forth between, there isn't much you can do but be glued to the screen in search of answers. The setup of Incendies is ingenious. Two twins, one male, one female, are given separate letters by their deceased mother, one to be delivered by a twin to their father who they thought to be long dead, and one to be delivered to a brother that they didn't know existed. While the male twin is reluctant to go out in the search and stays behind, his sister sets off to her mother's home nation, deliberately left unnamed but clearly in the Middle East. On this journey, there's a lot of time jumping that reveals their mother's story, from the husband that got killed to the son that she had to abandon to the war that she fought in, the prison that she stayed in, and the torturer who impregnated her. I am simply getting emotional just thinking about what she went through. This setting allows for us to be introduced to so many characters and topics, the beauty and horrors, but mainly the horrors of translation, one's own family history, religion, education, war, immigration, and so much more are tackled here. Looking back, the story is fairly simple in layout, but it is so layered in its execution. Such a beautiful film with some of the best cinematography of that decade, such an impactful film with just an amazing story, and simply one of the greatest films ever made. Up to this point, I argue that Denis' filmography can be divided into three sections. 1. The Canadian productions. 2. The shift to Hollywood. And finally, the blockbusters and franchise filmmaking. Prisoners was his transition to Hollywood, and what a transition it is. Obviously, Incendies had a lot to do with grief and what grief can do to a person, how different people approach grief, and the meaning of grief itself. But Prisoners is grief incarnate. From the moment the kids disappear till the end, I can't name many movies that are as somber, depressing, and grief-filled as this one. I think at this point there are a couple of givens for a Denis film that I'll just get out of the way here. The cinematography is stunning, the performances are amazing, and go ahead and embolden, italicize, whatever you want to that point, because this movie's performances are all Oscar-worthy from top to bottom. Actually, this whole movie and all of the filmmaking behind it is purely top-notch and Oscar-worthy from top to bottom, except for one aspect, the script. And obviously, this is not to say this is a bad script, as there are some amazingly written characters, some highly tense scenes. I can still feel the tension of that last scene and a lot of of that has to do with the screenwriting. But there are just a few plot contrivances and things that happen that just make me suspend my disbelief a tad bit, and I hope that on a rewatch the plot, especially a lot of the mystery elements, reveals, and the entire Detective Loki Dover subplot in the second act would click a bit more, but it just didn't. At the same time, everything else in this movie is just so amazing that I still feel it is worthy of getting a 9 out of 10 from me, but it's just the fact that it could have so easily been a 10, but it just slightly stumbled. Before I fully dive into Enemy, I feel obligated to share my opinion that Jake Gyllenhaal is one of our 3 best actors that have been working in Hollywood since 2010, and if you disagree, you are just wrong. With that off my chest, my thoughts on Enemy are very simple. I love that it exists and that Denny took this swing, but I can't fully say that it hit for me. Easily his most experimental film. As with any other Denny feature, it provokes quite a lot of thought. For those that are not in the know, Enemy follows a man who lives a relatively mundane and boring life that learns he has a doppelganger, and the very tense and somewhat confusing aftermath of this discovery. Villeneuve's use of imagery throughout this film adds a lot of substance, and Gyllenhaal's dual performance couldn't be much better in my opinion. However, there's just so much for me to yet figure out about what is happening in this film that I can't with a pure heart say I love this movie. I definitely do like it though. When it comes to projects like this, I often look at the work of Satoshi Kon as the pinnacle. In particular, Perfect Blue is a narrative around identity, one's image of themselves and the image that they project that uses the elements that cause narrative confusion to enhance the overall experience. Enemy just doesn't quite do that for me. While well executed, a lot of the narrative confusion is just confusing, even after a second watch and probably after a third and fourth watch too. And while I did like the ending a lot more this time around, as it is much more final than I had originally remembered it being, it still hasn't clicked and I'm not sure if it ever will. A calm 7 out of 10 for now. Sicario is the first Villeneuve film that I knew of and saw as I got really into filmmaking in the history of cinema, and a movie that through the filmmaking alone made me fall in love with it. In addition to being one of the greatest visual storytellers that we have, Denny, much like Fincher and Nolan have, has proven in works like this to be one of our greatest technical filmmakers, with the ability to film some of the greatest action sequences and most tense scenes I have ever seen here. And while I don't see the fact that the action is the best part of this movie to be a flaw, I definitely do think Sicario would have benefited from a couple of narrative and character bumps. In my opinion, Blunt's performance isn't the greatest. The side story with the dirty cartel cop is good, but it just could have hit harder if Denny either committed to it more or less. Del Toro is amazing here and makes every non-action scene that he is in stand out, and with names like Johan Johansson behind the score and Deakins behind the camera once again, I expected nothing less from the visual oral. Sicario is a movie that I think is well worth a watch. Similar to Prisoners, I think the script is what really is holding it back. It has been talked about less and less as time has gone by and all of the people in the project have gone on to do bigger and better things, but the fact that it has been talked about less takes nothing away from how great it is as a standalone project. Easily an 8.5 out of 10 for me. Arrival is such a patient movie. In Arrival, we follow our protagonist, who is a linguist that is employed by the US military to help them communicate with aliens that have landed on Earth. And as with any other Villeneuve project, it ends up going much deeper. From beginning to end, this is a meticulously crafted narrative that through the filmmaking puts me in a trance as a film watcher that no other film has put me in. My biggest flaw with the last 2 films has been the script, but here that might be the biggest pro. The emotions evoked by Arrival are ones that I just can't quite articulate. The closest that I can explain is that I feel both calm and awe simultaneously. The situation presented, aliens stationing ships at multiple points throughout Earth, is one that we have been taught to occupy action movies and disaster films, where we as the human race must now come together to collectively destroy our enemies. But rather, Arrival takes a far different approach, one that involves human intellect and uses the aliens as a tool of human interaction and political turmoil rather than forcing them to be our sole enemies. As I think a lot of us learned during the pandemic, while it is nice to think of the artificial foe in front of us as being our main enemy and to idealize a world coming together to fight them, that just usually isn't the case. Man versus machine, man versus nature, man versus whatever can and always has been the background problem, but the foreground will always end up being man versus man. And within this dilemma is the idea of the intricacies, the beauty, and the horrors of translation. A topic covered in my favorite show of 2024 so far, Shogun, which y'all should definitely check out if you haven't. But back on topic, Amy Adams's and Jeremy Renner's characters here are our central figures, a linguist and scientist that must learn to talk with these aliens and then eventually share their findings with other humans without being misinterpreted themselves. themselves. A truly ingenious setup for a sci-fi film, and all this doesn't even factor in their amazing performances, the once again stunning cinematography and score that further adds to this feeling of combined calm and awe, and might I also add fear that I mentioned earlier. And still to this point, I haven't even mentioned what this movie is most known for: its tackling of time and the cyclical nature of the way these aliens communicate and the implications that has on the narrative, our main character, and the world as a whole. Arrival is a near perfect story. It probably is a 10 out of 10. It most likely will be a 10 out of 10 for me after my next watch, but for right now, I'm going to put it at a 9.5 out of 10. I like Blade Runner 2049. Like, I really do like Blade Runner 2049. Like, for real. I like this movie, and I'm sure when I go to watch this in IMAX, when it's re-released 3 years from now, I'll come back in the comment section and say, chat, I was tweaking. But for now, I just think this movie is good, but not much more. A bit bloated, in my opinion, at times aimless and a bit confusing, just as the first movie was, but just as with most of Villeneuve's work, it's a visual oral spectacle. For me, the pre-Harrison Ford half of it is kind of boring. Gun to my head, I won't be able to truly tell you what is happening aside from a broad statement. Post-Harrison Ford showing up, it picks up for me, and admittedly, the ending is amazing, got me to almost shed a tear, even though I wasn't fully locked in with the story up until that point. For me, a 7.5 out of 10 that will most likely move up in the future, but for now, feels a bit overhyped. At one point in time, I called Dune Part 1 a masterpiece. That point in time was my 2021 movies rank video, and while I don't disagree with that statement, I can't say I fully still agree. On a rewatch, Dune Part 1 is just as good as it was 3 years ago, don't get me wrong. The pacing of the film I still think is one of its crowning achievements. I argue that the third act of that film and all of Dune Part 2 wouldn't work as well as they do for me if the first 2 acts of Dune, which is such a dense work, weren't plotted as they were. The ability of this movie to immediately hook me into Frank Herbert's world is only paralleled by the Lord of the Rings epics, which is truly no understatement. And beyond that hook, Villeneuve and all of the other talent, both behind the scenes and on camera, did nothing short of their best to bring this world to life and make us all more invested in it with every passing scene, every passing decision, every glimpse into the future, every chip, every shatter, every explosion, every outburst. All of it is brought to life with such precision and such grandeur. It is so rare that a filmmaker can get everybody on the crew in such perfect sync, and the output is so amazing that it is compared to some of the greatest films and stories ever made immediately after release. 2 of the reasons why I wanted to go chronologically and not in rank order is because 1, I wanted to talk about Dune Part 1 and Part 2 together because, as I said in my previous video essay, this is one 5-hour-long epic, and 2, I see this epic as Denis' magnum opus, the culmination of everything that he has worked for in his career up until this point. As I said earlier, Denis just gets bigger and bigger, grander and grander, better and better with each film that he makes, but simultaneously he has never lost the personal touch and intellectual savviness that made his earlier films so great. He went from 4 very deep and personal movies about tragic events, each with an increasingly larger scale, with his Canadian productions ending in a masterpiece work and the magnum opus of that era, Incendies. As he moved to Hollywood, the scale and ambition of his films got larger and larger with each project, eventually ending with the magnum opus of his second phase and masterpiece that is 2016's Arrival. And finally, as he enters the blockbuster stage of his career, he has now taken all of the technical brilliance that he has amassed, the visual oral mastery of his craft, his increasingly perfectionist storytelling ability, and so much more to create his true magnum opus, a story that he's wanted to tell since the age of 14. It can be up to debate whether either of these films are truly his best. There's plenty of argument to go for a lot of his projects, but I think it is almost objective that Dune Part 1 and Part 2 are the pinnacle of his career to this point, both financially and filmmaking wise. Part 1 is an amazing setup, and Part 2 is some of the greatest payoff ever put on the big screen. Speaking about each film individually, I would say Part 1 is a 9 out of 10 for me, but Part 2 is the easiest 10 out of 10 that I have given to any film on this list. Part 2 takes all of the masterful elements of the first movie, Timothy's performance, the cinematography, the action, all of Paul's actions, the political elements of the narrative, the intrigue for where the plot will go, and one-ups it all. Everybody is giving a better performance in this one. Everything is bigger, better and grander in this one. Similar to Sicario, there are some of the best action sequences ever to be put to film here. The world feels bigger, Paul's journey feels more impactful, this movie is bigger, grander, louder, and while those things don't always imply better, this time around it is. And I'm just gonna leave it there because there has been so much discourse around both of these films over the past couple of months, and there are plenty of videos out there that you can watch aside from this one that will explain why this movie is so great, explain why both of these movies are so great, and explain why Denis is such a masterful filmmaker. And with that, we have gotten to where we are today. Denis truly does have one of the best filmographies of any 21st century filmmaker. While he did start off a bit slow, he still has no stinkers in my opinion, and on the contrary, he's produced some of the best films to come out throughout this century. A truly brilliant director. He continues to work with some of the best cinematographers, composers, actors, and editors in the industry, and his ability to get the best out of them all is awe-inspiring. I did promise a final ranking of his films, so from bottom to top, I'd go August 32nd on Earth, Maelstrom, Enemy, Polytechnique, Blade Runner 2049, Sicario, Prisoners, Dune, Arrival, Incendies, and at number 1, Dune Part 2. Drop your thoughts on Denis and your rankings in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.